Okay, sorry for the inconvenience there. Okay, so this is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness. And this is the Evolution of Science Fiction webinar series. And today's webinar is based on book 2 of the series. What you see up there is a covered book 1, volume 1, and this is from volume 2, The Time Machine to Metropolis. And it's actually going to cover quite a bit of the history of science fiction from around 1900 to 1930. And so I'm going to be highlighting various books and authors and events during that time. But to really get the depth of this, as you'll notice, this is 6 chapters I'm going to be going through. I'd recommend when the book comes out, which is on the way, that you buy the book. And it's module 9, the early 20th century, disturbing the peace, dystopias, disasters, adventures, films, and the pulp. May you live in interesting times, from Confucius. And during the first few decades of the 20th century, there was great, significant, and multidimensional change going on within human society, from transformations in technology and society and entertainment and the arts and music and science. Here's just a set of representative images of different significant people and events during that 20-30 year period. With the intensity of change that was occurring around the globe between the rise of communism and World War I and transformations in physics and in art, people of the era felt both extreme anxiety and apprehension over the future because of the rate of change and the novelty of things. But they also felt at the same time significant hope, given all of the various technological inventions that were coming along, like the airplane and the automobile, and the spread of electricity and the radio. So it was a very a mixed reality emotionally, the best of times, the worst of times in lots of ways. And you might, in fact, identify with this period with respect to today, where people talk today about the significant level of change going on in the world across many different dimensions of human society. During the period that we're going to look at today, people felt the same way, and in fact there was significant multidimensional change occurring. And out of that we get a I use the word cornucopia, plethora of different types of science fiction writers and science fiction stories. And the best way perhaps to sum the whole thing up is that it was an age of great creativity, great diversity in terms of the types of stories that were produced, the writing styles. Up here I have just a sampling, and we're going to be looking at that between the emergence of science fiction cinema, the emergence of science fiction comics, the emergence of science fiction pulp magazines with Hugo Gernsback with his monocle there. Probably the most popular science fiction writer ever in terms of sales, book sales, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and just an incredible variety of science fiction novels. And the emergence of science fiction as a social movement with the emergence of science fiction fandom. So there was a great deal of creativity going on, both creativity that expressed great hope and amazing views of reality, as well as a whole slew of very depressing and dark novels and visions of the future, such as We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. So we'll be highlighting different aspects of this, but the thing to keep in mind in general is that while Wells was writing his futurist stuff, his utopias, his dystopias, there were a whole slew of other science fiction writers and creative individuals who were really exploring in great detail and color all the different aspects of science fiction, both through text and through visualization. Just as a quick review, last time we did talk about H.G. Wells and his early development and his fascination with evolution and the future of humanity, and his early science fiction classics like The Time Machine and The Invisible Man and War of the Worlds, and then inventing a second career for himself by becoming a futurist in writing Anticipations and The Discovery of the Future, and then all of his future war and utopian and dystopian science fiction, like The Food of the Gods and The Sleeper Awakes, culminating in his intellectual masterpiece, The Shape of Things to Come, and then his later work in terms of trying to publicize his vision of an ideal future through The Open Conspiracy, and numerous other novels, numerous other nonfiction works. And then a little comment at the end that Wells actually become depressed and in despair over the future and over his own career with his final book, Mind at the End of Its Tether. But Wells greatly contributed to the evolution of science fiction for sure. However despondent he became in terms of his feelings of how much he had an impact on things around him. Now, today we're gonna, as I mentioned, talk about the first few decades of the 20th century, beginning with that theme of disturbing the peace. And I've already brought in that theme with the introduction there, that it was a time when people became exceedingly apprehensive and anxious about the future, even if they were at the same time often enthusiastic. And we'll look at the beginning of science fiction cinema with Méliès and the beginning of science fiction special effects. And then we'll look at some of the significant changes that occurred in the early decades with respect to our understanding of the universe. And then we're going to look at what I refer to as a cornucopia of science fiction, an immense array of novels that were produced in the first couple decades. And in particular, I want to highlight out two of the most imaginative writers of that era, Edgar Rice Burroughs, who all of you have probably heard of, but even more imaginative and more colorful, who many of you probably have not heard of, was Abraham Merritt. And then we'll talk about some of the early dystopias like We and Brave New World and The Iron Heel. And then we'll look at the emergence of science fiction magazines with Hugo Gernsback in Amazing and Wonder Stories. And we'll look at the blossoming or flourishing of science fiction art with Paul. And then we'll look at comics. And then finally, we'll look at what came of science fiction cinema by the end of the 1920s with the great Russian classic, Aelita, The Lost World, Woman in the Moon, and then finally Metropolis. And Metropolis being kind of the culmination of this period of evolution in science fiction. So to go back to the beginning, apprehension, but at the same time, in 1900, a World's Exposition was put on in Paris that presented to the public a celebration of progress. And in the middle of this great World's Fair or World's Exposition was the Palace of Electricity, which was a construction where all of the power for the whole exhibition was generated from this palace. And it was a demonstration of the incredible advances in technology that had been occurring across Europe in particular, and all different countries around the world had exhibitions at the Paris exhibition. Oddly though, in order to appear global and cosmopolitan, they also had exhibitions that were created for various third world countries. But they had the appearance of being like a variety of human zoos, meaning the Europeans, even though they wanted to embrace cultural diversity, had various other countries in Asia and Africa have exhibitions, but they viewed or treated them as if they were somehow primitive and to be looked at like we're looking at some kind of more primitive version of humans. But basically, the whole idea of the exhibition was to visualize the future based upon the creations of the past, and then out of that, to imagine how we could create a future from all of the various inventions that people had been putting together over the last couple decades. So it was a celebration of progress based upon acknowledging all the things we had done in the past with a very optimistic attitude about where we were heading in the future. So that's the part of 1900 which looked at the future as very optimistic and positive. And that was very pervasive throughout Europe and throughout the United States. And we also saw the ongoing evolution of the visualization of the future. And here's an interesting thing that emerged around 1900, actually a little bit earlier, which I refer to as postcards from the future, where various different images were created of different amazing technological advances that would occur in the next couple decades into the 20th century. So people were being optimistic about the future, and they were attempting to visualize things such as down there in the left-hand corner, you could see students in a classroom with headphones on, and the teacher up on the right-hand side where they're pumping in lessons through an electronic medium. On the right-hand side, you could see people looking at movies and videos sitting in their homes, and you could see extremely elaborate cityscapes and people flying through the air on mechanical wings. So there's a lot of imagination going on, visual imagination going on regarding the future, very optimistic. Now, around this time, one art movement, of which there were many others, emerged, futurism, developed in Italy, which really embraced the future, reveling in speed, machines, progress, and even violence. And the futurists came out of Italy, I think I might have mentioned that already, and they presented a form of art which highlighted a futuristic, energetic, transcendence over art from before. And here's just some examples up there. Now, people sometimes will mix up futurism as an art form with future studies as an academic discipline. But futurism as an art form and as a philosophy was definitely one of the innovative art forms that emerged that threw an emphasis on the future. And in fact, they actually wrote a manifesto, and we intend to sing the love of danger, of energy and fearlessness, to exalt aggressive action, feverish insomnia. So this is a very energetic and Dionysian approach to the future, and an approach which is enthusiastic, an approach which sees things changing as a consequence of the machine, of technology, of the fast pace of life, and really getting embraced. And on this particular theme, I would ask you again to compare different voices of today which embrace accelerative change and technology with futurism, which embraced accelerative change and technology 100 years ago, connecting the two together. But they also, of course, brought in an art form which was definitely different from the past. And also during that time emerged Art Deco. And Art Deco threw an emphasis on futuristic and modernized visioning. Here we have an image of the Chrysler building, which was constructed on Art Deco principles. But we also have an image of the Rocketeer and other images I've collected. And there's a lot of Art Deco that's up on the web if you ever want to look at it, that has this modernist, streamlined, different kind of aesthetics than the aesthetics of the 19th century. And this aesthetics also is going to have an impact upon science fiction. In fact, just to leap ahead, this is part of the aesthetics that went into the creation of Aelita and Metropolis, was Art Deco aesthetics, as well as a bit of futurism too. So art was evolving with a new kind of aesthetics and vision around the turn of the century, which in fact would impact and reflect back into science fiction. So that was going on. Now, in the middle of this, we have Méliès. And Méliès was a French magician who had a magic house, and one day went and observed the first public demonstration of the movies in around 1880, 1890, and was totally enthralled with this new technology. And keep in mind that Méliès is a magician. And so Méliès began to create movies that were reflective of that magical vision that he had, where he would create these effects that were strange and bizarre. Like in this image here, we have Méliès in the middle there, his head looking like a giant head, with him sitting over on the right-hand side next to it. So Méliès began to try to create magic on the screen. He was creative, fantastical, and surrealistic. And he produced hundreds and hundreds of movies in the period of around 1900 to 1915, 1910, including the first science fiction movie, A Trip to the Moon, which there's an image up there on the left-hand upper side. And A Trip to the Moon was sort of a combination of Verne's novel about going to the moon and Wells' novel about going to the moon. Now, an interesting thing that you might notice is that these images are in color. And Méliès and his wife actually colored a number of their movie productions frame by frame. They were produced in black and white, and then he colorized them by painting in different colors through the various scenes in the movies. And also, for example, in the top one there where we see the woman sitting on the moon, that's his wife. And his wife frequently appeared as an actress in the movies, in his movies, and he frequently appeared as an actor. So he was the creator, the writer, the producer, the director, and often the central actor along with his wife in his movie productions. Now, what's extra interesting and valuable, there's another one of his images from another one of his movies, is that a lot of these movies can be viewed in total on YouTube. They're up there. Most of Méliès' movies have been lost, but a lot of them still remain where you could watch them. They're not necessarily all that long. In fact, I think the longest one he ever made was like about a half an hour, but you can watch A Trip to the Moon and The Impossible Voyage and The Man with the Rubber Head and The Astronomer's Dream. They're all up there on YouTube. And it's very fascinating to see how special effects begin to emerge and develop with Méliès in his various fantastical movies. So this is going on during, the first decade of the 20th century. And out of that's going to grow a whole new dimension to science fiction. In the same period that art is being revolutionized and cinema is coming into its own, our vision of the universe is transforming in physics and in science. Between the development of the theory of relativity by Einstein and the equivalency of mass and energy, and the introduction in those theories of the possibility of time travel and of a dynamic universe and quantum physics with Planck and Bohr and Heisenberg, where the universe no longer seems to be an absolutely unambiguous and objective reality. The principle of complementarity and the famous story of Schrodinger's famous thought experiment of Schrodinger's cat, who's both dead and alive at the same time till you open the box. And multiple universes, the many worlds theory of the universe that came out of quantum physics. And then the icing on the cake, which didn't come till a little bit later in the 20th century, is Hubble and Lemaitre demonstrating that the universe actually was more than just the Milky Way, but was indeterminately large number of other galaxies all moving away from each other. And out of that, Lemaitre developed the idea of the Big Bang, that sometime in the distant past, everything had been squashed together and then in some manner or form exploded and began to spread out, creating the universe. So our vision of nature through Einstein, through Hubble, through Planck and Heisenberg and Bohr, it changes dramatically in those first couple decades. And this is the universe in which science fiction would go out and explore. The universe that, the scientific vision of the universe that informed, increasingly so, 20th century science fiction, a whole new revolution in physics. That was part of the unsettledness of the early decades of the 20th century. Contemporary with that, in Russia, there were a group of writers, Fyodorov, Tsiolkovsky, and Vernadsky, who created a philosophical, science fiction sounding, cosmic vision of the universe and the future of humanity, generally referred to as Russian cosmism, which included ideas like from Fyodorov to control the future evolution of humanity, to realize immortality, to bring all living beings back, all living humans back from the dead, to conquer space and modify the body. Tsiolkovsky created the first scientifically plausible explanation of how rockets would work and proposed that we should colonize the Milky Way. And after his nonfiction, he actually wrote some science fiction novels to go with it. Vernadsky, the third significant figure here, is the person who developed the notions of the geosphere, biosphere, and the noosphere, and saw those three levels as evolutionary stages in the evolution of matter, where each level controls the previous ones. So mind controls life as life controls matter. The noosphere concept would be taken up by Desjardins later on, and then eventually by Frank Tipler and other people as well. So the Russian cosmonists saw technology and science as provided a means by which we could transcend nature, we could move out into the universe, we could explore and colonize it. And so that has all the trappings and feelings of great science fiction epics that would come later on. And on top of it, over here in the United States, the first successful rocket launch was finally achieved with Goddard in 1926. And Goddard was our premier rocket engineer technologist here in the US. And in fact, Goddard had been inspired to work on rockets after having read H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. And Goddard is very well known for a quote, which I'll put up here right now, just so that you, before we go on, the quote from Tsiolkovsky, "Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot live in a cradle forever." And the quote from Goddard, which has come down, that people frequently use, "It is difficult to say what is impossible, for the dream of yesterday is the hope of today and the reality of tomorrow." So indeed, while physics was transforming, at least Russian scientists, philosophers were working on a new kind of vision of the future that had lots of similarities to what we end up seeing in science fiction to come. Now, here's where we come to this next section, and I decided to call it a cornucopia of science fiction because indeed, in that first 2 decades of the 20th century, there was this amazing variety of different novels written about the future about war, about space, about time, about evolution. In fact, it was an era of incredible creativity. Future wars, cosmic disasters, the collapse of civilization, journeyed out into space and time, evolution, aliens. And I have up here a image from the cinematic production of The Lost World, which first appeared as a novel, but then later on was made into a silent movie. And it's funny sometimes how they would advertise these things, because on this poster, on top of it, which you may or may not be able to read, see gigantic prehistoric monsters battle modern lovers, which doesn't really apply to the movie and clearly didn't apply to the book, but this was to grab people's attention and get them to come and watch the movie. And we see here the influences of Hollywood mentality already at work in taking science fiction and throwing romance and other elements of the Hollywood mentality into the movies. But there's lots of things that appear during this period in terms of novels, in terms of the creativity of them. Now give me like 30 seconds. I just got to grab one thing and I'll be right back to you. Okay. So let's just highlight some of these novels of this period. And there's too many to go through in any detail or depth, but I'm going to pick out some of the ones that I think are the best. If you want to read more on these, you can look at my forthcoming book, or it's a great resource if you want to go out and spend $100 on it, Science Fiction, The Early Years by Everett Blyer. And Blyer in that book has plot summaries of every science fiction novel written up till 1930, plus lots of the stories too. And I said that, everyone. And people who have looked at this monstrous of a book will agree that this is a, the best resource of early science fiction up till 1930. It's a giant book, but they're great summaries. And if you want to read more on these, or you could buy a lot of these books, or you could read volume 2. But Blyer is a great resource on this period. Let's begin with the man who lived in the shadow of H.G. Wells, George Griffith, who was one of the most popular science fiction writers in England around the turn of the century. And here's an image from his novel, Honeymoon in Space. And notice it's two individuals in spacesuits looking at a bunch of skeletons. And in fact, this is a scene from those two honeymooning couples on the moon. But before we go over to Honeymoon in Space, which I won't really say any more about, Griffith wrote two incredibly elaborate novels of future war with central female characters who were strong, powerful women, one of whom was good, the angel of the revolution, and the other one who was absolutely evil, Olga Romanoff. And the battle scenes, the amount of carnage, the disasters that are imagined in those two novels equal anything that Wells produced during that time. In one of the novels, the first one, The Angel of the Revolution, the world is conquered by a group of individuals who decide we've had enough of war and we're going to turn humanity into a peaceful, authoritarian global society. In the second one of the heirs to the Russian Tsar decides that she wants to bring Russia back as that dominant force and aligns together with a new Muslim militant empire and attempts to reconquer the world. These are two very graphic and powerful and big novels that were very popular during the time with strong female central characters. And both of them had lots of interesting illustrations in them. And George Griffith was very, very popular right around the same time that H.G. Wells was popular. And you could buy both books and you could read them, and they're very fascinating in terms of the levels of battle scenes and weaponry that somebody else besides Wells was able to imagine back in the 1890s. These are two more future war novels giving people the heebie-jeebies. Now, right around the same time, and we've been looking at writers from France, writers from England, writers from the United States, science fiction was spreading around across the globe. And a great novel produced by an Italian science fiction writer was The Year 3000, A Dream. Came out in 1897, a little bit after War of the Worlds. And here's a quote from it, which I just want you to get a feel for the kind of language that was used here. And I just want to make sure I get it correct. Voluptuary theater, the symphony of pleasure. Spectators will enjoy the harmonies of music, perfume, artificial flavors, and hedonistic vibrations, whatever those are, while their sight continuously gorges on the most varied kaleidoscope of images ceaselessly passing over the stage. This is quasi-virtual reality, quasi-hedonistic entertainment carried to the extreme, envisioned in the world in the year 3000. It's a vision that combines a rationalist, enlightenment, support of the idea of advancing science and technology, but also, as a good Italian, acknowledges the importance of pleasure and hedonism in the future too. And in the story, just to highlight one fascinating thing, the central character is being given a scientific award, a global award, as producing the most significant new invention of the last decade. And what he produces that he gets this award for is he creates a technological device that will give everybody in the world, when they wear it, mental telepathy, so that you could read other people's minds. But of course, they could read yours too. And the argument is that if everybody could read each other's minds, people won't have bad and evil and ugly thoughts, and we'll become a much better society because we'll mutually control each other's minds. And this was deadly serious. Interesting novel. Right around the same time though, and Wells loved this novel, The Purple Cloud came out. And I just have a quote up here from The Purple Cloud, which gives you a sense of how Scheel wrote. And this is a disaster novel. Stalking like a cock, flaunted my monarchy in the face of the heavens with blasphemies, dribbled, shaking up my body in a lewd dance, reduced some city to ashes. The central character burns all the major cities in the world, and revel in redness and the chucklings of hell, rolled in the drunkenness of drugs. The Purple Cloud is a famous disaster novel in which almost the entire population of the world is killed through this toxic purple cloud that emerges and spreads across the entire globe. And one man survives the whole thing. And he feels responsible for it. I can't go into the details of it, but he turns into a lunatic with the whole world at his disposal, dresses himself up like an ancient Middle Eastern character, and builds a giant palace. But in the end, he falls for this beautifully young woman who also had somehow escaped the disaster. But the literary quality of this is very Dionysian and experimental, and it is not in any sense conservative in the imagery created by this lunatic character who literally rules the earth for 30 years until he's finally subdued by a young woman. But a very famous story, very well worth reading. It's gone through many, many editions, and is definitely worth highlighting as one of the great works of imagination of that period. Now I have up here a bunch of other ones that were written during that time too. Gulliver Mars actually is significant because it looks like Edgar Rice Burroughs was inspired by that one when he created his vision of John Carter and the Barsom series on Mars. But the one I want to say a couple words about is The Wonder, or the Hamptonshire Wonder by Beresford, which is an early view story of an advanced human born that is ostracized and seen as bizarre by the other people who live around him, but has these mental capacities which far exceed anyone, and apparently, as described in the novel, literally can rewrite his own mind any way he wants to. That is, he has this omnipotent power over his own mental software, to put it in modern terms. And he doesn't live very long, and it's a very interesting novel describing his early life, but it's a great Superman vision of the early period of the 1900s. And would influence Stapleton's eye. Now, people may have heard of Jack London as a writer of great adventure, but Jack London wrote some interesting science fiction-like novels during that time, including Before Adam and the Star Rover. And just to mention something here about one of them, in this case here, Before Adam, we have a character who has dreams of a previous lifetime, which seem to be dreams of one of his ancestors, and the ancestor appears to be something like a pre-Neanderthal hominid, maybe an Australopithecus. And it's a very effective depiction of how a proto-human would experience reality. And Jack London got into the whole idea of conscious minds being able to communicate with other conscious minds across time, where I can remember things that occurred to somebody else from way, way before. In this case here, a primitive ancestor. Before Adam is a very interesting novel, and it's psychological, and you could say maybe it's not quite science fiction, although it's often identified as being one of his science fiction novels. But this is an exploration in consciousness, which as well as was the Star Rover. Now, around the same time, we have the emergence of a new kind of horror, in this case, cosmic horror. And here are two images, two paintings that were created depicting scenes from William Hope Hodgson's The Nightland. And William Hope Hodgson was productive or prolific only for about 10, 15 years, because he went into World War I, volunteered to be a soldier in World War I, and was killed. But before he died, he wrote two all-time classics in science fiction, in particular cosmic horror. The House on the Borderland, which extends out millions and millions of years into the future, about a man whose mind can be transported through time, who lived in this old decrepit house that is terrorized by creatures, humans, that look like pigs. If that sounds sort of nuts, the whole novel has that quality to it, but it's superb. The scenes of the future, the distant future, are incredibly psychedelic, imaginative. And the creatures, the swine men, are hideous and ugly and terrifying. But then after that, he wrote his best piece of work, which I consider one of the best pieces of science fiction of the whole era, The Nightland. And this one takes place untold millions of years in the future in a giant pyramid, beginning a giant pyramid that's 30 miles high, that houses all of the remaining humans across the face of the earth. The sun has gone out, it's dark, and the whole surface of the earth is populated by all kinds of bizarre creatures, And this gentleman who lives in this giant pyramid goes out to try to find a woman who he believes is his long lost love from the 20th century. And the novel has this dark, imaginative feel to it that really takes you off into a bizarre and different kind of reality. It's a far earth, far future novel, like the first one had that element in it too, The House of the Borderland. And it is so dark and glum and at times almost monotonous that I really think there are 4 pages in that novel where the same 2 pages are repeated over again and you don't even notice it. And I just sort of spotted it. I would recommend reading this, except for the fact that to read The Nightland is literally to go on the journey itself, that this character has to go on across this bleak, terrifying reality with various strange beings around him and save this woman. It's one of those kinds of books that you just have to read it to see how unique and strange it is. But people later on, like H.P. Lovecraft thought it, and Clark Ashton Smith thought it was one of the great books of horror ever written. Now, The Machine Stops came out about the same time as those other novels did. And The Machine Stops is very well known because it's been made into a movie. It's in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, and people frequently are aware of it because of the fact that it depicts a future world that seems to be sort of like our world today, where everybody lives in self-contained cubicles or cells, is technologically hooked up to everybody else through various technological devices, video screen. All of their food and supplies are brought into them. They never have to go out. They never have to touch another human being. And they all lead these technologically facilitated lives. And then the machine breaks down. And they're stuck having to go out into the real world. And I know people I've talked to have read this too or have seen the movie. And it's very prescient regarding becoming totally dependent on technology, where everything is taken care of for you, but in the end, you lose your humanity and you find the presence of other people in the flesh and blood repugnant. Now, one novel I'll comment on here, Garrett Serviss, who we mentioned with Edison's Conquest of Mars, wrote other novels about space exploration, and also a novel, The Second Deluge, which was like a retelling of Noah's Ark in the 20th century. But the one I want to mention here is Distant Worlds by Friedrich Mader, who is one of the most popular German science fiction writers. And Mader in Distant Worlds seems to be the first person who conceptualizes and describes faster than light travel, going out into outer space, and journeying beyond the solar system and actually landing and visiting inhabitants of planets around Alpha Centauri. And it's filled with lots of scientific lecturing about astronomy, and it has a religious undertone to the whole thing, but it takes you out past the solar system, and this is like around 1910, and envisions faster than light speed. So it's an interesting book to read, and you still can get it. I was able to get it, even though it's kind of rare now. And it's got lots of speculations on what an advanced form of alien life would be like that lived in another star system, which recommends itself for that. One of the most popular science fiction writers of the era, George Alan England, probably next to Edgar Rice Burroughs, the most popular writer of science fiction of that time, wrote a very famous trilogy, the Darkness and Dawn trilogy, in which the world undergoes this great disaster. Most people are killed, and a man and a woman wake up 1,000 years in the future wondering what the hell happened. an attempt to rebuild civilization. It's a great saga of romance, of love, of having to go out into a terrifying new earth that has a big crack in the middle of it, and try to recreate civilization over a period of 100 years. Highly recommended. It has all kinds of cultural stereotypes in it, but it's a very rousing tale, and it's a tale of humanity being able to conquer adversity and of the importance of love and of commitment to each other in the middle of a dangerous world that these two characters wake up into. But you know, a great rousing tale. Now, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote two very important science fiction books, The Lost World and The Poison Belt. Here's a cover from The Lost World, where there's a picture of his very famous fictional lead character, Professor George Challenger. And The Lost World is, I would recommend reading because, for one thing, Doyle was a really great writer. And so he does a really fantastic job of describing the characters, of describing this lost world with dinosaurs, as well as the Poison Belt. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, is the gentleman who invented Sherlock Holmes too, in his writing career as well. And The Lost World was, as I mentioned earlier, made into one of the first silent science fiction movies. And in fact, it's the first movie in which you see the work of O'Brien, who eventually went on to do King Kong and was the teacher of Harryhausen. Back in Germany, one of the most popular science fiction novels of the era was The Tunnel, or Der Tunnel, written by Bernard Kellerman. This novel sold millions of copies. They made 3 movies of it, English, French, and German. The pictures down there you see here are from the English version, which you can watch. I found it someplace, I think on YouTube you could watch it. And it's a great story about a determined scientist who decides to build an underground tunnel running from Europe to the United States, and succeeds at it through adversity, through all kinds of challenges. And it's kind of an interesting double picture of the scientist, because on one hand, he's very determined, wants to create this tunnel, but and down deep, he really feels like this would be a great accomplishment, but at the same time, he's kind of heartless and cruel, and you know, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, and who cares how many people get killed in the process. Good story though, and very, very popular. A Voyage to Arcturus influenced C.S. Lewis and Tolkien tremendously. This is one of the most psychedelic novels I've ever read. Okay, it's about a gentleman who is transported to a planet orbiting the star Arcturus and goes on an adventure where, through the adventure, he keeps growing new body parts and losing other body parts, keeps murdering people, has sex with a variety of women on this planet, and has philosophical debates on the meaning of life with characters on this planet. And as you can see from the different covers for this novel, is a very strange and bizarre vision. It is one of the most strange and bizarre visions that I've ever come across in science fiction, because it has kind of a dreamlike quality, a very psychedelic quality. In the end, you wonder if it even makes sense, but it became very influential, very popular later on. C.S. Lewis actually used it as an inspiration for his writing of his own science fiction space trilogy 20 years later. I read through this book twice, and I still don't think I understand, in being a philosopher, what the point of the whole thing is, but it's a significant novel if ever you want to go and look at it. Came out in 1920. The final person in this cornucopia that I'm going to discuss is Rosnay the Elder, who was a Belgian writer writing in French, who is the author of the very famous story, Quest for Fire. And many of you probably have seen the movie that that novel was based on. But Rosny wrote science fiction for about 30 years, and he's considered to be the most significant French science fiction writer after Jules Verne. And he was very poetic, lyrical, imaginative, created different kinds of aliens. And the best way to describe him was that he attempted, through his stories, to give you a feeling for the incomprehensible. He was a consciousness expanding writer. You see a cover there in the middle, translated as The Navigators of Infinity. And on the cover is this creature with 6 eyes. She is a Martian. Each of the 6 eyes has a different color. Her name is Grace, and the human who visits Mars falls in love with her. And it's a very interesting, touching story about learning to appreciate beauty in an alien form, a strange and different alien form. Rosny also envisioned the world taken over by the evolution of metal in the death of the earth, that out of the industrial waste we are creating would emerge a new kind of life form that was metallic and would spread across the earth and kill all human beings. Another World is about a Superman who could see another dimension, and in this other dimension are creatures that are two-dimensional and move around through our own world, and we can't see them and they can't see us. And he's sort of a fitting conclusion to this first 20-year period, because indeed he was, on one hand, an exceedingly lyrical, poetic, and stylized writer, but he had a really great imagination, and he went beyond the stereotypes of aliens, the way we would normally think of aliens, and attempted to stretch one's consciousness and to see the great mysteries of the cosmos. Now, that's probably a good spot to stop for our halfway point. It's actually about 55 minutes, but we'll stop right there and let's see if we come to the most popular writer of the period, who I didn't even talk about yet, Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I use the expression, the efflorescence of imagination, because Burroughs may have been lots of things that people will criticize him for, like he wrote for the young male mind. He wrote adventure stories with lots of action and repetitive plots, that he appealed to a certain kind of male ego, that he always stereotyped his women in the stories as beautiful, sexy babes. But he was immensely, and still is immensely popular, because he was a great writer. He pulls you into his writing and he keeps you engaged, and he has this incredible imagination for inventing aliens, especially. Now, I also have up here at the same time, to introduce Burroughs, 2 paintings by Frank Frazetta of Burroughs' scenarios. And Frank Frazetta would become one of the most popular science fiction artists in the 1950s and 60s, and did all of Burroughs' novels, covers for all of Burroughs' novels, and created these very muscular, warlike male figures and these beautiful, half-naked, sexy female figures, which is sort of what Burroughs' mind was all about. So Frank Frazetta captures the mental imagery of Burroughs. In fact, here's another one of Frazetta's images of a Burroughs novel. And there's a picture of Edgar Rice Burroughs, who was very unsuccessful in life, and then in 1 year wrote both the first Tarzan, which was a colossal success, and ended up writing 27 novels about Tarzan. And in the same year, wrote the first Mars story, A Princess of Mars, which became known as the Barsoom series, because the Martians referred to their planet as Barsoom. And in the series, which ran into 11 volumes, 11 novels, we have this incredible assortment of different Martians. We keep finding different Martians on Mars. There must be 15 or 20 different kinds of Martians on Mars, all different colors of the skin that are fighting against each other, and often are eating each other too. In fact, I should mention in Burroughs' novels, there's a lot of cannibalism on top of it all. There's also lots of attempted rapes. Although there's no sex scenes in any of his novels, there's lots of attempted rapes, okay? And there's also lots of Martian creatures that you run across in those 11 novels. And there's lunatic, power-hungry Martian leaders who see themselves as gods or goddesses. And there's cliffhangers continuously through his novels, which is part of why he was engaging. They've only made, as far as I know, one, or actually it's two of his novels, A Princess of Mars and The Gods of Mars, into a movie, but they would definitely lend themselves, they made some other of his stuff into movies too. The Mars series would definitely lend itself to contemporary special effects cinema, because they have lots of action, lots of fighting, lots of killing, lots of sexy babes. There's always a woman in every one of his novels who the hero is trying to save. But his women are at the same time very strong physically, have great character, great courage, great determination, but the guy always has to keep saving them. So that's part of the reason why he gets criticized, is because he keeps playing the same plot over and over again, but he keeps inventing new creatures. In one of them, he has Martians who have one part that is the head and the other part that is a body, and the head ride on the body. He has another set of Martians who can hallucinate, who can materialize hallucinations, and the hallucinations can kill you. He has all kinds of inventive things with his characters, with his scenes. That's part of why he was so popular. And as I mentioned, there's action and action and action all the time. He's pure escapism in one sense. Just sort of to see a comparison, those first images were from early editions of the Barsoom series. Here's three images that are repaintings done of the Princess of Mars and Thuvia, Maid of Mars, that were done by Michael Whelan. Now, if you haven't ever heard of Michael Whelan is the science fiction artist who has won Best Science Fiction Artist of the Year more times than any other artist. He's won it like 15 times, and he's contemporary. He's probably about my age right now, but Michael Whelan is very colorful, very artistic, very interesting, and there's some of his images of three of the Burroughs Barsoom novels. And the Barsoom series was very popular, but Burroughs wrote a slew of other series that also became very popular. In fact, there's estimations that Burroughs has sold well over 100 million copies of all of his novels and books, which I think far exceeds any other science fiction writer up till today. Now, these two are also Frank Frazetta images, and they are derived, I believe, from another series that Burroughs did, the Pellucidar series. And the Pellucidar series begins with At the Earth's Core, and instead of going to Mars, our central heroic character goes into the interior of the Earth, where he finds the Earth hollow. We go back to the hollow Earth theme again. In the middle of this hollow Earth is a small sun, and this hollow Earth, where people live on the interior surface of the Earth, is ruled by super intelligent Rhamphorhynchus. Now, Rhamphorhynchus was a type of flying reptile that lived during the dinosaur era, and along like with the pteranodons or pterodactyls. But the Rhamphorhynchus are called Mahars, and they have evolved intelligently, and they rule all of the human-like creatures who live on the interior of the earth. And what, among other things, what they do is they eat them. And as I mentioned, there's lots of gore, lots of violence, cannibalism, and humans or creatures, other creatures are always eating humans in Burroughs' novels, aside from trying to rape the beautiful women. And there's lots of new beautiful women in this series as well, too. And then he wrote a trilogy, the Land the Time Forgot trilogy. The second one was The People the Time Forgot, and the last one was Out of Time's Abyss. And this one is about an island that's about 200 miles in diameter that somehow nobody has ever discovered in the Pacific Ocean. And a submarine goes into this island underwater and discovers a strange kind of reality. Now, Burroughs gets very inventive here too, because what he does is he rethinks out evolution. And when you first land on this island, on the interior of it, at the beginning of the story, around you are dinosaurs. But there's this river that the submarine follows. And as you move up the river, the life forms change. And you move from dinosaurs to prehistoric mammals, to early hominids, to more advanced hominids. And so as you move across the river, you follow the history of evolution. And Burroughs suggests in that series that the beings in this world actually evolve through all the different stages of evolution in the same sentient being. So what starts as a dinosaur, over time, that thing will evolve into a mastodon, then evolve into a monkey, and I know that's really dramatic, and then eventually evolve into humans. So he tries to rethink out a different version of evolution. It's a lot of people consider this his best trilogy in terms of action, characterization. Oh, and we have Germans in here. There are the bad guys and Americans, and there's 3 new babes, beautiful babes that need to be saved. And we have flying humanoid creatures, which you could see a picture of on there. The Wemu, who also eat regular humans. Again, creatures are eating each other all the time. And then he wrote The Moon Maid. And The Moon Maid is his futuristic novel, a futuristic series in which he picks on both the Nazis and the communists. And it takes place starting in the near future, runs out to the distant future. And in this one, the creatures of the moon invade the earth and conquer the earth. The fascinating thing in this is at the end of the trilogy, the Earthmen eventually conquer and beat off the moon creatures, but they do so dressed up as indigenous American Indians of the plains, but waving American flags. And they beat off the invading aliens. And it's kind of a critique or parody on the Indians beating back the Europeans and pushing them out of North America, but the people are carrying American flags. It's a different kind of series, but it definitely has lots of strong points, and it also, again, has beautiful women in it. Strong, beautiful women. And finally, he had his Venus series with more beautiful women, and one in particular. And we have a gentleman who lands on Venus now and has lots of adventures too. So throughout the whole thing, he kept grabbing the readers, selling millions of copies. His stuff keeps getting reprinted. Everything he wrote that was popular at the time stays in print, and people criticize him for being juvenile, but he's just been amazingly popular and influential. Now, also on the dimension of imagination, Ray Cummings was another one of the most popular science fiction writers of the 1920s. And I'm not going to talk about all of his stuff, but I will talk about his famous novel, The Girl in the Golden Atom, in which a group of gentlemen who you see up there on the All Story Weekly cover, where the first story first appeared. One of the gentlemen is a chemist who creates a chemical compound which can shrink people down. Here we go again with shrinking. And this gentleman sees through this powerful microscope that he has this beautiful woman who lives inside of a golden ring. And he shrinks himself down and finds this beautiful woman and retrieves her and brings her back up to our size. The interesting thing in this novel is his description of tunneling down through levels of size and reality, from our macro level down to a universe, a microverse within the golden ring. And he does a very, very good job at that. But it's a standard plot, and he was very popular, but this was his best known work. And it's worth reading if you want to read about this whole idea of miniaturization, which keeps occurring through science fiction. Now, this was like the end of the 1919 into 1920. Now, I mentioned back a little bit ago that although Burroughs had a great imagination, clearly had a great imagination, the individual who probably excelled or exceeded his imagination during that time was Abraham Merritt, who was a magazine editor. And he began writing kind of combination science fiction fantasy toward right after the end of World War I. And the first novel that he wrote was The Moon Pool. And The Moon Pool was the most famous, popular, influential science fiction fantasy novel of its time. And it's a story about a group of explorers that go into this underground cavern and come upon a whole intricate world that involves various kinds of humans, a beautiful woman, frog people, dwarfs, giant, super intelligent beings, and this hideous being called the Shining One, which is sending psychic vibrations or emanations out of a pool in tune with the moon. And this was one of the stories that got republished in Amazing Stories. People tried to imitate it. And the thing about it that really stuck with you when you read it was that Merritt could create psychedelic scenes. He could create, with his language, the most incredibly rich and chromatic visions of strange realities of anybody ever. And a year later, he did this, which I think was his best thing, The Metal Monster. And there's a quote I have up here from The Metal Monster, which came out in 1920. And this is definitely a novel, a story worth pondering and thinking about from our present point of view. One of the quotes, the quote I have up there is, group consciousness, gigantic, operating within our sphere, operating also in the spheres of vibration, energy, force, metallic, crystalline, magnetic, electric, inorganic, with every power of organic, conscious, mobile, inexorable, invulnerable. That describes the Metal Monster. Again, we have a group of explorers, and they're drawn into this secret location. And what they encounter is they encounter this being that is made up out of innumerable, and I mean quintillions, of individual metallic shapes that can organize themselves into an indeterminate number of different configurations. Their main embodiment is literally a city. They are a conscious, intelligent, self-configuring city. And they can detach pieces of themselves into different forms. And they're in tune with this naked babe who's on the cover here. The story involves the encounter, and her name is Norella of the Lightnings. And these humans encounter this thing, this intelligent and metallic being, and go on this psychedelic trip, just looking at it, observing it, seeing what it does. And it's an immense work of imagination. And it gets into group consciousness, inorganic consciousness, self-configuring kind of nanotechnological being, because that's what this thing is in a way, except a little bit higher. So you have all of the individual parts that can organize any damn way they please, okay? And the thing literally self-destructs at the end, because two different conscious factions emerge which fight against each other. The most overpowering thing about the whole thing, though, aside from that image he has, this image of this kind of intelligence and this kind of different kind of body that the creature possesses, is again his language, his descriptiveness. I'll just give you a feel of merit. This is just one little chunk, a paragraph from The Metal Monster. We were slowly gliding towards something that looked like nothing so much as a huge and shimmering bubble of mingled sapphire and turquoise. It seemed to draw to itself the light, sending it back with gleamings of the gray blue of the star sapphire within pellucided azures and Lazarus-like clouded jades, with glistening peacock iridescences and tender milky greens of tropic shallows. Little turrets, globular and topaz, yellow and pierced with tiny hexagonal openings, clustered about it like baby bubbles just nestling down to rest. That's how he wrote. He was a trip, and very, very popular. The Moon Pool and Metal Monster were both great works of imagination. The back cover I have up there is from The Face in the Abyss, in which we have the snake mother who was half human, half snake. I won't go into that, but the first two that I mentioned there were his most well known, The Metal Monster and The Moon Pool. And he was very popular during the 1920s. In fact, some people would say that he was the most popular fantasy writer of that period, although his stuff all has a science fiction emphasis. Now, next person I'm going to come to here in terms of imagination is S. Fowler Wright, British writer, scholar, studied Dante's Inferno, studied Shakespeare, studied Milton, wanted to be the new H.G. Wells, and the one novel is actually in 2 volumes that I want to comment on. The Amphibians in the War Below is a time travel novel that he wrote back in the 1920s, and it is a more imaginatively rich speculation on the future evolution of humans than The Time Machine. It vastly exceeds The Time Machine in terms of the detailed richness that Fowler creates of what humans 500,000 years in the future will be like. And indeed, the species that the time traveler encounters are amphibian humans who are able to totally control and be attuned to their bodies and have complete autonomous, dispassionate capacity of consciousness, and look at us as extremely chaotic and primitive minds. It's a really interesting, elaborate study of what possible future humans who are mentally evolved could be able to do, that are able to consciously control their thoughts, don't experience any conflict, ambivalence, are totally in tune with their bodies, can communicate with life forms through their consciousness and control it. And just a very, very interesting novel about future human evolution. Now, I just noticed we're at 11:40. I did not get through everything I wanted to get through, but I don't know whether I should rush with what I have remaining or just take up we will be taking up dystopias of the early 20th century next time. We can go a little longer if you want. It's up to people. I don't know what people think because I'm already over 10 minutes right now. If you want to go longer, I will, or we want to stop, I will. I can't hear what anybody's saying. Here, let me go.
I'm going to put this on pause, Tom.
Yeah, dystopias of the early 20th century. Now, I kept those as a separate category, and we'll move forward from there. Okay. In the first couple decades of the 20th century, there were some very significant, interesting dystopias written. The Iron Heel by Jack London, we've already encountered, and the Iron Heel is a dystopia based on a criticism, fundamental criticisms of capitalism, arguing for a socialist utopia in the future, but seeing the primary culprit, the primary problem with our world today being capitalism. And if capitalism is allowed to continue to grow in power and influence, where will we get? What kind of an ugly, disastrous world will emerge as a consequence of capitalism run wild? And capitalism run wild is the Iron Heel. And it's a philosophical novel with a lot of philosophical argument at the beginning of what's wrong with capitalism and why is socialism much better. But then it turns into a very violent novel about the capitalists squashing the socialists and gaining control of the entire world. Second, 10 years later, The Messiah of the Cylinder was written as a critique of H.G. Wells. And it's a story about a man who goes 100 years into the future in a cylinder and encounters a world that is totally controlled by science and reason. And its hero, 100 years in the future, its central cultural figure is H.G. Wells. So H.G. Wells becomes a character, literally a historical character in the novel. And it's a story about this man, the Messiah, who leads a rebellion against a world controlled by science and reason. And that a world controlled by science and reason, inspired by Wells, will destroy the human heart and destroy ethics and become cutthroat and without any spirit. And bottom line, which might seem kind of incomprehensible, is that this is a Christian science fiction novel. It advocates for the return and ascendancy of Christianity as being the central controlling force in the world. And when Christianity lost power to science and reason, that was when things started going downhill. This is a very interesting novel. It's written very well. Victor Rousseau, who wrote it, was a popular writer during the first few decades of the 20th century. And I have a friend who actually gave me a first edition of this book, which is one of the more valuable books I have in my science fiction collection. And it reads very well, and amazingly, it's a Christian science fiction novel. City of Endless Night by Hastings is amazingly imaginative. It was written in 1920, predicting the rise of Nazism, the beginning, predicting World War II, predicting that the Germans would attempt to create a super race, and the novel opens in the future in Berlin, which is a domed city that has 300 million inhabitants in it and is at war against the entire rest of the world. And Berlin is a eugenically evolved society where the emperor is treated as a god and people have been genetically selected to form a set of social classes living at different levels in the city, performing different functions, serving the whole, and it's only the elite at the top of the dome, inside of it, who have freedom along most human dimensions. One whole level, though, of the city is dedicated to debauchery. That is, they have their Las Vegas and prostitution and drugs on one level of the city as an outlet for all the regimented order they impose on all the inhabitants of the city. And so it's very prescient. Fritz Lang was probably inspired by this novel when he did Metropolis. And the intricacy that Hastings develops in describing this city is very impressive, along the biological, the social, the technological. He really creates this a world that's very vivid and very different. And it was one of the best dystopias written in the early 20th century. But I would have to say that the best dystopia written in the early 20th century was We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. This book is the first book that was banned by the Soviet Union. And Zamyatin was Russian, and he was an enthusiast originally for the communist revolution. But then after a while, he became disenchanted with what he saw, and he wrote this book and had to take off out of Russia. The book got banned, but the book is very impressive creatively. For one reason in particular, Zamyatin was able to describe and to imagine a form of consciousness, of human consciousness, that is distinctly different than ours. And the central character, whose name is a number, writes a diary, which is the novel, and you get a first-hand, first-person experience of a mind that doesn't conceptualize and doesn't feel the world the way we do. He understands the world in terms of geometry and mathematics. That's his mindset. And as a quote from the novel, the ancient God created an ancient human capable of mistakes, and therefore he made a mistake himself. The multiplication table is wiser, more absolute than the ancient God. It never, you understand, never makes mistakes. And there is nothing happier than digits living according to well-constructed eternal laws of the multiplication table. And our central character is tempted by a woman who represents chaos. The city that the central character lives in is a city that is ruled by rational order. All the buildings are made of glass, so everybody can see what everybody else does. Everybody gets up at the same time, goes to work at the same time, eats at the same time, but is given 2 hours a week of freedom where they can lower the shades and have sex, but only with somebody who's picked out for them. And our character is tempted into the world of flesh and chaos and feeling, and tempted into the idea that he has a personality, an identity, because in this world, what is sacred is we. What is hideous and evil and ugly is I. There is no I. I needs to be eradicated. It should be we. But our character, as well as other individuals in the society, sees everything in terms of abstract mathematics. So he describes people, he describes them as if they are some kind of geometrical or mathematical form. And as a strange and totally appropriate ending to the novel, after he has had his brain exercised of imagination, you got to get rid of imagination in this world. This is supposed to be a critique of communism, by the way. His neighbor tells him that he has discovered that in reality, there are no things which are infinite, that everything in reality is finite, means it is determinate. And infinity was the great philosophical threat to this mindset, because infinity goes on and on forever. You can't ever realize a unified absolute order if there are infinities in existence. And the neighbor discovers that there is no such thing as infinity, and therefore everything can be ordered and contained and determinate, and that's the happy ending to the whole novel. So the ending of the novel is a mathematical proof, which in some sense is emotionally and philosophically elevating. And the funny thing about this novel, after I read it, is that even though it's seen as a dystopia, you wonder, is this a dystopia or is this an ambiguous dystopia? Because the argument is made in here, and it's going to be made in the last dystopia that I'm going to mention, that what's more important, having freedom or being happy? And the argument in here is better to be happy and screw freedom. And the character, in fact, describes himself, and then I'll go on to the final point, the final novel here. I am like a machine being driven to excessive rotations. That's how he describes his temptation from this woman. The bearings are incandescing, and in a minute, melted metal will begin to drip, and everything will turn to nothing. Quick, cold water, get cold water, logic. I am pouring it over myself by the bucket load, but the logic sizzles on the hot bearings and dissipates elusive white steam into the air. That's how he describes himself. So this is a different kind of mind, a totally understandable different kind of mind, and a different kind of reality which Zamyatin was able to create. And this is a very famous book. People say that 1984 was inspired by it, as well as our final dystopia, Brave New World. And that's where I'll stop for today, Brave New World. But let's talk about Brave New World for 5 minutes. Brave New World doesn't come out for 10 years more. And I have up here a quote from Neil Postman. Orwell feared that we would ban books, but Huxley was more concerned that no one would want to read books. And Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed by us, but Huxley believed that perhaps the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. And Orwell feared that we would become a captive culture. That's 1984. Huxley, on the other hand, feared that we would become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy, and the centrifugal bumble puppy. And all those three things at the end there are in Brave New World, the feelies, the orgy-porgy, and the centrifugal bumble puppy. And Brave New World is considered to be one of the great novels of the 20th century, not just science fiction novels, one of the great novels of the 20th century. Aldous Huxley was the grandson of Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, and the brother of Julian Huxley, who we'll get to in a while. Huxley, Aldous Huxley, wrote this book as a parody critique on H.G. Wells, and in particular, H.G. Wells' A Modern Utopia and Men Like Gods. And so Huxley wrote this as, what would happen if we had a world ruled by the kinds of things that Wells imagined, science, rationality? How would it operate? It's sort of an extremist view in terms of a critique of rationalism and scientism, but it's a very powerful book. To begin with, the first 20 pages for something written in the 1930s is absolutely, totally jolting and shocking. It describes how children are created in a laboratory and why this is a much better way to do it than having mothers and fathers. It offends all different kinds of conservative, traditional sensitivities in that first 20 pages. The book is very sexually explicit, and so for science fiction, usually not being very sexually explicit, this book clearly went over the edge and gets into sex. In fact, the central characters in Brave New World are encouraged to be promiscuous, and they're discouraged to have single monogamous partners. It's a world that is superficial and trivial in the sense that everybody in it is captured by pleasure and immediate satisfaction through technology, through pills, through other forms of psychological release, and everything is very ordered at the same time. Books have been out pretty much, but people don't want to read them. So is religion. And the fundamental debate that emerges in the book is between the individual who controls operations in North America and John the Savage, which had been raised outside of this modernized or ultra-modern human reality, 600 AD, not 600 AD, 600 years from now, after Ford, who is the god in this world, along with Freud, interestingly. The debate between whether you want to have challenge, misery, suffering, and periods of unhappiness, but the right to choose, or whether you want to be content and blissful and in a state of euphoria all the time through social order and drugs and technology. And the argument that goes on between the two of them, by the time you're finished with it, you really end up sympathizing with the leader of North America. The Savage, John the Savage, who reads Shakespeare, which nobody else does, he loses the argument, clearly loses the argument. And at the end, he goes off and kills himself. So this is supposed to be a dystopia. This is supposed to be a critique of Wells. This is a very prescient projection of a world that is filled with bread and circuses to distract our minds, a drug world, the techno world, an immediate satisfaction world, a world that's controlled from the top down and nobody reads books. The mind is atrophied, but in the end, they're all content. And everybody has lots of sex and feels good all day long. And if you don't feel good, if you're not into this hedonistic continuous reality, you're dysfunctional. And at the end, John the Savage, who reads Shakespeare, feels so distressed and disappointed by the whole thing that he kills himself. And the argument, he doesn't win it at the end. So here's the issue at the end of this with Brave New World and we, and then I will definitely stop. We talk about utopias and we talk about dystopias. What is a dystopia? What is a utopia? Is it relative to where we're standing right now? Are our present views of what is good and what is bad coloring what we see as being a desirable, preferable future? These two books create great psychological dissonance. They're very famous and they critique different trends in the world of the day. But in the end, you wonder whether or not we see them as dystopias simply because we want to hold on to certain values. In this case here, the primary value that gets critiqued in here is individual freedom. But the argument comes back in both books that what you sacrifice by pursuing individual freedom is happiness and order. So it's worth reading them. It's definitely worth reading them. If you haven't read one or the other of them, I would really recommend it. Both of them are highly intelligent, very creative, and it had a big impact on our thinking and big impact on science fiction. And were two of the best science fiction novels ever written, and they were produced during this era, along with The Nightland, which I would also list as one of the best science fiction novels of the era too. So I'll definitely stop at that point because we still have a little more, but we are definitely, we definitely should stop. It's at least 12 o'clock.